Well, hello. It is a gorgeous day, like we have in March before April when it gets a little cold and dark and rainy at times. But today's a gorgeous day to take flight with Bob Henderson. You'll see what I mean when you see what he has in store for you. Bob Henderson.
Thank you, Gene. Let me make sure this is working because I have a tendency to mumble. Sometimes I've been told.
Black microphone.
I've got a wire right here. So can everybody hear me? Yes. Okay. This is going to be fast and furious. This turned into a 3-hour presentation the last time I did it in Lebanon. They would not stop asking questions. These are like 50 grizzled pilots that their jaws are on the floor going, why don't we know about this? My goal right now, I've rededicated myself to historic preservation and education, are unsung heroes. And this is my top 4. Cornelia Ford, we need a statue of her at B&A. That's my goal. Cornelia Barksdale, which you probably never heard of, started the first free lunch program in 1912 that my grandmother is connected to. The 105th Squadron, they're 80 years at B&A, getting ready to move to Smyrna for their 4th move. And our Jack Harding, which we'll talk about today. I gave this presentation to my scoutmaster in his living room a week before he passed. The most intelligent, wisest man I ever met. He at the end of it, he said, this story wasn't lost, it was buried. And it's really the story behind the story of why nobody knows about this. Jack Harding, really, I guess this is a riches to rags to riches story. But this event, the first world flight in 1924, accomplished very significant objectives. The first Pacific crossing ever, the first North Atlantic crossing, and both of these are in Arctic conditions in biplanes. This could never be done again. There are no map. They had maps and eyeballs. No radar, no beacons, nothing but National Geographic maps. The first crossing of both, first aerial circumnavigation, and this really ushered the United States onto the world stage because there were 6 countries competing in this race. This is the original book that was published by Lowell Thomas. Lowell Smith is one of the pilots. I've got an original out there with autographs of all the pilots involved in it. This was released in 1925, but it doesn't tell the whole story, and there's some changes that happened in the narrative. This is the best version I've seen. The First World Flight, The Odyssey of Billy Mitchell by Spencer Lane, and this just came out by David Randall. I'd recommend that too. Dick Wood, my scoutmaster, got this book when I first started telling the story about Billy Mitchell's court-martial, and I haven't read it, but I'll look through the index, and there's not one mention of the First World Flight, nor have I been able to find much of anything in any narrative about Billy Mitchell, who is credited with basically starting the Air Force. Jack Harding was the only Nashvilleian. There were 2 Southerners, one from Mississippi and Jack. Jack was a child prodigy. He was he was John Richard Harding IV, direct descendant through the Harding line, but I didn't know that they had a bunch of land in Donaldson where he grew up. It was called the Stones River Farm. He was a mechanical genius. He took his mother's sewing machine apart at age 10. After looking at the wood shop, got it back together and it ran better than it ever had. His dad gave him a Cadillac, and this is the car that he got his first experience working on engines. Well, the Hardings, fell on hard times around the turn of the century, Belmead and their cousins in Donaldson, and basically the money was gone. John was born at Belmead, but like I said, he grew up on the Stones River Farm. He wanted to go to Webb School because his family was well educated, and that was his objective, but the money was gone, and Webb didn't even know this guy existed until I talked to him last year. they gave me his records, and so we verified that. He worked his way through web, cutting wood to fuel the fire, and is a part-time locksmith. He graduated in 3 years and went to Vanderbilt engineering school, where his grandfather had gone to school. Old Mechanical was the building. This is an aerial from the 30s of the Stones River Farm area, and this is basically Pennington Bend, where Opryland is. This is approximate location of their farm, where they had a lot of equestrians and did a lot of hunting. There's Vanderbilt Old Mechanical. So he does a year at Vanderbilt. He goes to UT for unknown period of time, maybe a semester, and then he goes up to Detroit to work in the summer to earn enough money to go back to Vanderbilt, because he's paying his way through college working as a mechanic. And well, World War I breaks out. Well, his mom divorces John's dad, which was very scandalous in the 19-teens, and moves to Beverly Hills. And so John's a little reluctant to join because he's worried about leaving his mom behind. Well, she meets the guys in the newspaper business and ends up doing pretty well, and so that kind of lifts him off the hook. So he goes to the Army Air Service. Now, it wasn't the Army Air Corps. It was originally the Army Air Service, which was a smaller department than the Marine Corps. And he signs up wanting to work on airplanes, and they make him a cook. And they sent him to Fort Oglethorpe and then down to Kellyfield in Texas. And one of the guys is making fun of him because he had one blue eye and one brown eye, and made some crack about that. Well, John lays him out. So they bust him and make him a ditch digger. Well, that wasn't working out too well, but on the side, he's working on staff cars. And before long, the officers are like, this guy's a freaking genius. And so they get sent up to St. Paul, and they make him a master electrician and mechanic, promote him to sergeant, and then he ends up getting a commission out of that. He knew more than the instructors. So he is the mechanic. Now, in this point in aviation, right after World War II, number one, the United States is dismantling their aviation down to bare bones. We went from like 25,000 planes to 1,200, and even less than that later on. The Navy's trying to pretend like aviation doesn't exist. You know, their battleships are, you know, their prized possession. Well, Billy Mitchell proves that wrong. So now here's another couple of examples of why this is not out there. Now, I'm going to go ahead and fess up. This was the U.S. Air Force Museum, and I think they finally cleaned this up. These are endurance flights. Now, I can't think of the first world navigation around the world is anything but an endurance flight. It's not mentioned. Library of Congress, same thing. It's not even on the list. Lindbergh is. What Lindbergh did was nothing compared to what these guys pulled out. McKay Trophy Award, that's the most prestigious aviation award that's out there. I think this has been corrected. I finally got John on Wikipedia. It took 12 submissions in a year and a half. We're trying to get the story out. Smithsonian, the only plane that exists for the public to see, well, it's not even available right now because the Air and Space Museum is under renovation, so I think this is still in storage. But this is the Boston. The other plane is the New Orleans, which was Jack's plane. Well, it's in storage at the Museum of Natural History in Los Angeles, and nothing's being done to rehabilitate that. I've got a model of the plane out there to give you some idea of the scale. The wheels come up to your waist. It was massive. Well, Billy Mitchell, if you read the first book, I'm like, who planned this? This is a logistical, unbelievable accomplishment, and like, who thought about going west instead of east? Billy Mitchell. This was all his plan, and he gets no credit for it. His sister, Ruth, said on his deathbed, his one regret was that he never got credit for the first world flight. A lot of politics in this. Like I said, it was the Army Air Service. Billy came back from World War I as Brigadier General, Distinguished Service Cross, but he was too much of a loudmouth and didn't play politics very well, so they put General Patrick in charge, and General Patrick could play the politics, But he was kind of like a shock absorber with Billy, because Billy had unbelievable ideas, but he had very little patience for bureaucracy. I'm going to have to skip over this, so I'm going to make my time. The court martial, Billy Mitchell, is interesting. I think it's pretty accurate. It's Elizabeth Montgomery's cameo role with Gary Cooper playing Billy. Keys to success. They used 4 planes instead of 1. The British had 2. The British had tried it once before. The French had tried it once before. They're all on their second attempt, along with Argentina, Italy, and it goes from there. So flying east, you got a tailwind, right? So that get less, less fuel, more airspeed. Well, Billy looked at it and says, well, if we went the other way, well, they would get across the Aleutians before it got really bad and make it through the monsoon season in Southeast Asia and then back across the North Pacific before it got socked in. So this made a lot more sense. And using 4 planes, actually Billy wanted to use 6. So they put together a logistical team of officers, and logistics were the key in this. They were every 3,000 or 4,000 miles, they had different sectors, and they had spare parts, engines, destroyers out waiting for them, anything they needed for support. The manpower involved in this, like I said, it was the largest peacetime logistical operation of the 20th century. It was about 250,000 people, and it's said to be a bigger logistical effort than the moon landing was. And it certainly is on scale with that if you look at the period of time and what they accomplished. It could never be done again today with the same equipment. No nav aids, no radar, no beacons. It included a wide variety of different countries, different agencies, and the key was the U.S. Navy, because they would have ships stationed every couple of 100 miles for support, and the Navy didn't like Billy Mitchell too much. And the Navy said, well, we'll be part of this if you get rid of Billy. And so they get rid of Billy, send him off to Germany, and then Japan, just to keep him busy, and that's when he comes up with his predictions of World War II, which is prophetic, to say the least. But logistics were key. 64 props, 42 sets of wheels, radiators, you name it, everything they could think of, strategically around the world. I've got a Google map if anybody wants to reference it. It's under belmont.gmail. Donald Douglas has put him on the map. He had a Navy contract for this torpedo bomber, which is what the Douglas World Cruiser was modified to do. And he risked his whole career on this because the Navy probably canceled his contracts after he built this for the U.S. Army Air Service. But it really, this is what made him famous in aviation. They used the Jenny's engines were used they're abundant but extremely unreliable. One of the things I learned through this is in a biplane you had 2 seats. I thought the extra seat was, like a trainer, an extra pilot. Well, no, it was for a mechanic, because these planes were so unreliable, they would break all the time. So that's how Jack Harding got pulled in, because if you're a pilot and you're getting ready to go on one of these endurance flights, you want the best mechanic you can find. And Jack was it, so that's the reason he got selected. He was trying to get to Washington, D.C. from Dayton, where he was based, and he hitched a ride with one of the future pilots of this, Lee Wade. Arnold. And so Arnold's over West Virginia, and the engine quits. Well, there's not a lot of places to land in West Virginia. And so they're like, getting lower and lower and lower, and all of a sudden the engine comes back to life a couple hundred feet from this ridge top. And Arnold looks to his right, and Harding's out on the wing with the cowl up, fixing the plane. He did that a couple of times. I mean, you just can't make this stuff up. But the equipment they had was very rudimentary. The most advanced thing was the earth induction compass, which never worked. It got Lindbergh across, but this one was designed to eliminate vibration and stuff from making the compass go off where it's supposed to point. And you got magnetic variation around the world, which as a navigator is a very complicated process to try to compensate. This is the cockpit. I thought that tube was for talking, and then I found out probably for something else. Some of the gear, they had so much weight, I think it was 4 tons, that they had to start eliminating things that they could take, like a parachute. No life raft, no life preservers, no radio. They weighted too much. Yeah, and they were really tough to take off with a pontoon. So they had interchangeable systems. So they had pontoons, then they could switch off the wheels. So that made it a lot more efficient, but it increased their weight dramatically. That's the original 8 that was modified. And only 2 of the 4 planes made it, but everybody survived. That's a picture afterwards. Lowell Smith, probably the most incredible pilot at that time. He set all sorts of endurance records and was really key to getting them to navigate it. They said they called him the human homing pigeon. He could just find stuff instinctively. Maybe because he was descended from Daniel Boone. He was also Pancho Villa's pilot. Yeah. And one of the other guys on this flight, Lee Wade, was on the ground on the other side. He was a real ideological guy, and he really felt like Pancho was getting a bad deal, and that's the reason they never found him, because he was spotting for Pancho. Now, I don't think they made much of that when they got him onto this this world trip. That came out later, I'm sure. Really, a forest fire commander, never lost a man in 2 years. I think he actually did the first West Coast to East Coast, back to West Coast trip ever. And he was the first to refuel in the air. Now, this is basically a garden hose. And these planes are flying pretty close together. And I remember reading the first time they tried this, the guy's trying to grab the hose, and he actually hits the switch that turns the gas on, that douses him with gas. If that had hit the cowling, boom. So this is some pretty high risk guys. I mean, you talk about the right stuff. I mean, that's what this story is all about. And there's just so many parts of this. It's hard to even stop it. It really needs to be a mini-series. There's the pontoon. So they start out in Santa Monica. They have all sorts of problems getting to Seattle, and they call that a mulligan, basically. They say, okay, we're going to reset the race at Seattle. So that's the official starting point. They really started at Santa Monica. And, man, it was a baptism by fire. The first route up to Western Canada, I mean, they're having to fly basically about 10 to 15 feet because of the clouds. They had to stay underneath the clouds because they couldn't fly in the clouds. It was impossible. And they're dodging lighthouses and buoys and boats, scaring boats to death. Well, and Major Martin was leading this. He only had about 400 hours. He was not the best pilot, but they had him for his diplomatic skills and a major. All the other guys were 25 to 32 years old. But he broke a prop taken out from Seattle. Then he breaks the wing, landed at Western Canada. Now, this is a stopover they made at Prince Rupert, British Columbia. This is Prohibition days, but Canada didn't have Prohibition. I don't think that's pop. I was trying to figure out what beer that was. Now, what's on the pole is, I don't know. I don't want to know what that is all about. Canadians are different. There's Prince Rupert, the Aleutian sector. I mean, I've flown this route, and with the equipment they have, it's just unbelievable. I remember landing in Adak, Alaska, and I didn't see the runway until I felt it. It's just like that up there all the time, and the winds are unbelievable. It was so cold they would have to drain the oil from the planes, heat it up on the beach fire, put it back in. If they didn't get it in fast enough, they'd have to repeat the whole process. And then these winds, they were called willy-waws. They would just, like 100-mile-hour crosswinds, they would blow the planes out of their moorings. They have to go track them down and get them back. Well, Major Martin, he's not having a very good day. He flies into a mountain. And he survives because they're only flying, 80 knots and with a headwind probably 50 miles an hour. And he hits the side of a mountain and is gone for 12 days. They'd written him off completely, but he survived. That's an interesting chapter of this, too. So they're out. So we're down to 3 planes now. I think the wreckage, I heard, is in a museum somewhere in Alaska. So they're off, and there we go. So this is the tricky part. Well, there's a lot of tricky components of this, is that the Soviet Union we didn't recognize, so they wouldn't give us landing rights. The Chinese were in a civil war, so that wasn't an option, at least most of China. And Japan wouldn't even say yes or no until they took off. They had taken off from Seattle, still didn't have a deal. They send this Lieutenant Nutt, real name, to negotiate with a Japanese general. Now, how stupid is that? I mean, that was an insult right then and there. And they're just giving them a runaround. You know, the Japanese, I heard somebody say, you know, they're kind of like Southerners. We don't say no, we just don't say yes. So he's in the shower the next morning. He's like, this whole thing's going to fold because I can't get the landing rights. And he thought he was in the shower the next morning. He goes, Billy Mitchell. The Japs loved Billy Mitchell. The rest of the world loved Billy Mitchell. The French gave him every decoration they had. So they bring in Billy, and Billy said, well, remember that earthquake you had last year? It took out every building in Tokyo, except for one. The Imperial Hotel, designed by Frank Lloyd Wright. And they said at the time, wow, this architect's really good. He's going to go somewhere. So, all right. So going from the last Aleutian Island to the Northern Kuril Islands, which Japan owned at that time, was going to be long enough as it is. But it produced a lot of powerful storms, and they're like, what if we can't get through the weather there and we've got to land somewhere? Well, they had a contingency plan, so, well, we're just going to have to land in Soviet territory and take our chances and hopefully not end up in a POW or a concentration camp somewhere. So they take off, and they're headed to Piramashu, which is the northernmost island of the Kurils. And they were off by 1 mile on like a 400-mile hop. And what they were used for, the biggest thing, you know, you got your compass direction, but they didn't got wind. That is drift. So you got to compensate for drift, or you're not going to go in the right direction. So they would drop smokes and then circle back around to see which way the smoke. And then they had streamers on the back of the plane too. But this was very, very, you know, estimating. But the precision that they came. These are the little markers on the tail they had to know how to adjust their drift. Yeah, they were off 1 mile on a 600-mile leg over water. So this is the first Pacific crossing ever. And the Japanese are really behind this, but our president, I call him Uncoolidge, decides to sign the Japanese Exclusion Act. Folks, this is the beginning of World War II. It set their military in motion. It was a major, he signed this the day they landed in Tokyo. He could have vetoed it. This set off the Ku Klux Klan in California burning Japanese farms. It incentivized their military. Another interesting element, I'm going through the paper, 125 Jap brides arrived. Thousands of Japanese women were being imported to the United States, mail order brides. Now, they didn't have the roaring 20s. They had the opposite. They were in a recession during the 20s. So that's another interesting aspect. But so every place they landed, they had, you know, tens of thousands of people, mostly school children. This is the America song, and these are all pieces I got my hands on at date, and they let me have access to the restricted area. They sang the America song because they wanted to inspire their youth about it. They knew how significant this event was. Naval assets are too numerous. I'm still counting them up. They had destroyers. Now they had the Japanese Navy helping us out. This destroyer, so the fleet's up there waiting to get through Alaska, which they were making like 10 miles a day when the French are doing 500 miles a day. And so they're running low on gas and fuel. And so the Japanese destroyer invites them on board, feeds them, shares supplies, shows movies and all this. Well, let's fast forward World War II. USS Ford sank her. So into Japan, there's Coolidge. It's called the Johnson-Reed Act, which I'd never heard of before, but it basically eliminated the possibility of them coming here. Now, about this time, they're in Tokyo. I think they made 4 stops up and down, and they get to their jumping off point. They found out the British flyer had crashed in Burma, and his plane was destroyed. He was okay, but his plane was destroyed. And they were so upset, concerned, as a fellow aviator, even though he was a competitor, that they ordered the Navy to go take him a new plane. Apparently they had a lot of authority to get whatever they wanted to make this thing happen. Those are Jack's medals that I got to look at when I was in Dayton. I still have another trip planned. I haven't gotten to his audio file yet. So they take off for China. They did get into China through Shanghai. And it's just every time they land, the crowds are everywhere. Now over there, they're boats and boats. So they had to like clear, send a Navy boat through it to, scatter the people enough to be able to take off. Indochina, they go down. Smith's plane goes down, and they're lucky because they were doing a shortcut. Now, if they had pontoons, they couldn't land and, do a ditch in the forest. That would have been suicidal. But he found a lagoon to get into, and that's a whole nother adventure, a whole nother chapter that goes quite in depth. Finally, into India, the British welcome them. Of course, they're still in the competition, too, and they have a big dinner at one of the officers' club, and they're joking, "Oh, you Americans, you always got to do things differently. You're going backwards." But you got farther than anybody else. They knew they were about halfway. But they turn into rock stars in Paris. That's when it really breaks loose, and the French love it. They land on Bastille Day. They moved up their schedule. They knew they were close enough that they might be able to make it, so they really put on the steam and made it into that. These guys are just beaten to death, and they go out to dinner. At midnight, they get some guy says, "Oh, you got to join us at the Folleberg here," and they're like, "Oh, no, not another event," and they all fall asleep with these naked French ladies dancing all around them, and the newspaper said, "If these French beauties can't amuse these men, Lord knows what can." And then they get to Britain, and Stuart McClellan, who was the aviator that they helped get a new plane, his wife is the first to greet him and said, "Thank you so much for helping my husband." He goes down right after that, and she knows he's getting ready to do the reverse thing in the Aleutians, and he goes down, gets lost in the fog, but he is rescued by a British destroyer. That's Stuart. And all these guys are World War II aces. Back to the pontoons for the North Atlantic. They knew this was going to be the toughest, taking off out of Scapa Flow, Scotland, and nobody had ever done this route before. Well, like I said, these planes are breaking down all the time. A third plane goes down. They had a oil pump go out, and they had to ditch at sea. The swells were so high, they directed the other planes to keep going because it was too dangerous from the land, and they end up getting rescued, but they're through no fault of their own out of the race. So we're down to 2 planes. That was make it to Iceland. Nothing but concern. They have parts logistics issues. And, they get the word at this time that Coolidge is thinking about canceling the whole thing because they knew the odds in Vegas were 1 in 10. They knew there was a strong possibility they wouldn't make it through this leg, and he was more concerned with this election coming up of losing these guys than have them finish it and win. Well, word gets to Billy Mitchell, and he gets message to them in Iceland, said, "You guys need to pick it up and go fast." they're already trying to, well, the problem is from Iceland to Greenland, the most direct route to, let's just call it alphabet, is socked in with icebergs, and there's no way even a ship can get in there, so they're going to have to do a longer leg, which is 835 miles, which is longer than they'd ever gone before. They were in this cockpit, this is in the Arctic, for 11 hours, dodging icebergs all the way because they're having to fly so low, stay underneath the clouds. Well, the Italians decide, Mussolini, who's a big proponent of their aviation effort, ask Coolidge if they can tag along. And they have a more advanced plane. It's actually an enclosed cockpit, much faster. And so he said, well, as long as they don't get in the way and we don't have to give them anything, they can follow us. So the Italians join up and they take off, and they can't fly slow enough, so they're flying circles around our world cruisers, and they finally get tired of that and said, we're going to go off. And so they get in some bad weather, forced down, and they are missing for 4 days, presumed dead. The Navy is called off the search at midnight. At 12:40 something, they see a flare. It was the last flare the Italians had, and they saved him at the last minute. There's just so many, and I'm skipping over so much. Like I said, the magnetic variation flying that high, you've got all sorts of changes in the compass direction you got to calculate for. They had sextants, but it was very basic, very, very rudimentary. They didn't fly at night. So you get one sun shot off, which just gave you one line of position. There's Smiling Jack, they called him. He was the most popular guy of the group for sure. That was him in Greenland with the kids. And they make it to North America. So they're back on North American soil, and the party continues. Canadians loved them, big reception there. Boston gave the first real reception in the United States, and they just they were the most famous people on the planet, bar none. Flying to Mitchell Field. The Prince of Wales. So the Prince of Wales is dating the Princess of Romania. How am I doing on time?
I think you've got plenty of time.
Okay, good. So the Princess of Romania dumps the Prince of Wales, and they're back in Vietnam, Indochina at the time, and they're reading the papers because they got some time to catch up waiting for parts, and they read about this breakup, and Jack's got his eyes. He's like, I'm going to meet, because they get to meet the famous people everywhere they go. I'm going to meet the princess. So unfortunately, when they get there, the family, they're all families up in the mountains at their retreat. My son said that's the reason he got deposed, was they were always going up to the mountains. So anyway, they meet up the Prince of Wales. They turned down the King of England for a supper, because once they hit the ground, it was maintenance. I mean, that was the top priority, and this is a race, and they turned him down. He did meet Prince of Wales, said he'd race him back, and yeah, that's how genius this guy was. So he showed up there at Bowling Field, and then they go on to Washington, and back to Dayton. Dayton is where Jack was based, and all his friends greet him, and they said, "Where are our souvenirs?" And he said, "I didn't bring any." So they took him upside down and shook everything out of his pockets. That's his girlfriend at the time, but unfortunately she didn't last. He was a very popular guy. They all were. And so they do their victory lap around the United States. The landing in Los Angeles at Santa Monica, which is where they really started from, was the biggest thing that happened. It was estimated 500,000 people, and they had a fence perimeter with police and military security. Crowd knocked down the fence, they knocked down the cops, they knocked down the military, and then they go after the flyers and the planes and start cutting pieces of their clothing off as souvenirs, and they finally got it in control, and it was quite an event, to say the least. So Santa Monica, then on to San Francisco at the Presidio, that's Chrissy Field. And they got to meet all the VIPs. And look at Jack. This is in March. And this is in September. I just kind of see a little bit of maturation here, a little self-confidence. So on back up to Seattle, and they timed it 176 days, 26,108 miles in biplanes. Landing 28 September 1924. Of course, this last September was the 100th anniversary, which I went to, was a big event in Seattle. And both planes landed at the same time. They really, like I said, put the world on the map. All the other flights, none of them made it around the world. Everybody survived in the other 5 countries, and they were put on parade for quite a while. You can see the celebrity kind of wear and tear on their faces here in Chicago. Oh, they gave them all either Packards or Cadillacs. They were good. Oh, when they were in L.A., they brought an armored car truck with gold. I don't know how much they got. I mean, it was just like things that could. Here's a telegram from Jules Verne. Thanks. And there's Mr. Studd himself. Jack and his mom and the 105th greet him when he came into Nashville. That was a big event. And that's what the Tennessean gave him, silverware. These are all his medals and wings that I got the scan loss up there. There's a letter from Walter Williams, who was a 105th commander. And I thought Jack was in our unit. That's the reason I started going down this rabbit hole, because there was a picture of Jack in 105th biplane with the Old Hickory logo on it. Then I found out he was just getting a ride. But he was real good friends with the 105th, so there was a deep connection. And it's kind of like Cornelia Fort, and I didn't mention Cornelia Barksdale, the pre-lunch program. There were 3 things they all had in common is they were very significant historical figures, but they never came back to Nashville. And I think that explains a little bit of why they might have been forgotten. That's a picture of Jack at the, probably either McConnell Field or more than likely Blackwood Field at Hermitage, which was the first airport they had there. And that's probably the car he got from Chicago. There's an autograph I found in the Nashville archives that he sent back to Walter. Major repairs, too numerous to mention. So he goes from that to working. Well, the first thing he did, him and Eddie Rickenbacker started Florida Airlines, which turned into Eastern. They got wiped out in a hurricane, and so Jack decided to bail from that. It survived, but Jack went to work for Boeing as an engineer and a salesman, which is kind of dual brain, if you think about it. And is at Boeing for a couple of years, and then he gets recruited to go to Pump Engineering in Cleveland, which they made pumps. And what's really curious about this, and those are some of the reunions they had over the years, is I got into his file and found his passports, and he ends up in Austria in 1938. This is right before the Anschluss. Hitler still was hoping he could work something out with the West. What he was doing there, I have no idea. Probably something to do with pumps. I've got an Austrian friend that said they were big into hydraulics early because of the dams they built. So there was some connection at that time, and that's another piece of research that's on my radar for sure. Unfortunately, Jack didn't have any children, so nobody to look up. And really, Will's really helped me. I couldn't have done this without him. We spoke together this last summer on this, and he was quite a help. God bless his soul. So Boeing goes to Pesco with the pumps, and then he decides to form his own company, Harding Devices in Dallas, and he invents the first electronic fuel pump And it's used in B-29s in every plane that was built in 1943 or 44. So that made him a millionaire for sure right there. Oh, there's his passport. Austria. Very interesting. This is Sandpoint. I was there this summer. Of course, that's all built up. You can barely even see the monument that's still there. That's what it looks like when I was up there for the centennial. Jack had a lot of girlfriends. He finally married Blondina, who wasn't even blonde. She was from Des Moines or Davenport, Iowa. And Ridley asked, "How do you end up with a girl from Iowa?" I was like, "I bet you it was his speaking tour. That was it." Oh, he did on the road for 2 years, speaking about this, probably selling books with Lowell Smith before he went on to Eddie Rickenbacker. And they had a comic series called Smiling Jack. Ridley remembers reading it in the Sunday paper. It was in Nashville. And these were actually, I've got one. I should have brought it. It's actually a book this thick. Smiling Jack. Comic book is how they started, apparently. And, he gets into the hotel business because he's a visionary, and he sees a need for hotels near airports to accommodate their needs, and is said to be the idea man behind Holiday Inn. And I know he owned at least one, the one there in Dallas. This is one of his wind-driven gauges. They had these gauges that would pop out as backup power. And I've got all these in 3D modeled, which are identified out there on the posters. This is the fuel pump at Dayton. That was the first electronic fuel pump. These are all the manufacturers he sold it to. That's his helmet. And I saw Lindbergh's helmet was in this locker too. It's all climate control where the public can't access. So it was really cool. There's his Wade's. Thermos had just come out. That kind of put them on the map. And it was a great event. There was only one media, actually two. NPR, WPLN did a short, Nina Cordana did something in April. And then NPR on the 28th. No other national press coverage. Not even the CBS morning show, This Day in History. I mean, this is just bizarre. People don't believe it, or, I mean, this is all footnoted. I mean, there is absolutely no question. This is my AI. Kind of spooky.
Do it again.
I did this with my great-grandfather. It was really spooky. Yeah, he was definitely the most popular one in the group. Billy Mitchell actually did away with the chokers. He came out with a tie idea. So it's just a fascinating story. I'd recommend those books. And I guess I'll take questions if anybody has.
Is this online anywhere that we could go and look at it?
I've got a website.
Okay.
It's entitled B&A, like the airport, B&A Bucket List. It's got a lot of stuff on it, but if you just Google Jack Harding First World Flight, there's probably more out there now than there was then. But I know I've got it's quite extensive. I basically condensed the book into about 50 bullet points and with some explanation.
And what is the name of the book?
Well, there's three of them. The First World Flight by Lowell Smith from 1925 is Lowell Thomas, 1925, and then the other. Now my mouse. Yeah, the First World Flight, Billy Mitchell. Oh, my screen just disappeared. Okay, here it is. Yeah, the Odyssey, First World Flight, Odyssey of Billy Mitchell, and then this just came out, Into Unknown Skies, and they're on Audible too if you want to listen to them. And I've got the original Lowell Smith out there with original autographs, and the Odyssey of Billy Mitchell out there. I just bought that one as an audio tape to listen to it on the road. But they both, the first to even mention Billy, the First World Flight in 25. Another thing that was misled was they had a stowaway AP reporter that followed them from Los Angeles all the way to India, and they said he stowed away when he couldn't get any further with the Navy, and so they made up a story that he stowed away, but he really didn't. So they didn't release that until later, but he got busted from AP fired him on the spot. But Billy Mitchell is the main thing. You can see the beginning of, the elimination of him from the historical record, what little there was at the time. Another question over here?
Why were they trying to court-martial him?
What did they do?
What was the reason for a court-martial?
Oh, well, he called the president and the Congress something like murders. He had, and this is in the movie by Gary Cooper, the Navy didn't like him, but one of his best friends was a lieutenant commander who flew the airships. And he went down and died in Ohio in an accident that never should have happened because they had cut the budget for safety equipment and were flying into weather they didn't need to be in. So when he got killed, this was on the back of a bunch of other flyers, friends of his that were going down. He had had enough, and he let them have it. He said they were criminally negligent and almost something else, but it was enough to get him court-martialed. And they he ended up getting court-martialed. What happened was they forfeited his pay for 5 years, so that kind of takes you out right there. And but he was trying to get his lieutenant commander's wife on the stand, and they wouldn't let. And he finally got to her, and she told us. So at least the story got put out that the military was putting a lot of people in danger, flyers at risk. But it was a shot to take him out for once and all.
What year was the court-martial, and didn't they name the B-25 after Mitchell?
Yeah, the Mitchell bomber.
When was the court-martial?
It wasn't too long after that. It was when it was the USS Shenandoah, which we actually have an aerial picture of in the 105th collection. I'm thinking 26, 27, somewhere.
Court-martial, but they still named a plane after him.
Yeah, well, see, when World War II happened, they pulled his records. They pulled all this stuff out that he predicted Pearl Harbor within 10 minutes, 12 years prior. So all this stuff gets pulled out, and they're like, this guy was a prophet. He was a genius. He knew air power was going to make the difference. So that's when he got the recognition, and Harry Truman gave him the Medal of Honor. He died at the age of 38, so never got to see it all the way through. Anybody else? Back there?
Do you think you knew Frank Andrews, also from Nashville?
I bet you did. I haven't done a lot of research on Frank. I'm approaching the airport authority as we speak to try to get some historical documentation. And in the terminal, beyond country music, there's nothing but guitars in there. And I think they're agreeable to it. And he's one of the top, Cornelia Fort, Frank Andrews, Bob Hoover. The list goes on and on. Right here.
Yes, I was just asking, was Nashville a real center for aviation?
Yeah, it was one of the first postal routes. If you go to McConnell Field, which they went from Blackwood Field at Old Hickory to McConnell Field at McCabe Park, it says on that plaque it was the first mail route to Chicago, maybe from the south. I don't know exactly, but there was something significant. The airport, of course, aviation goes back to 1921 after World War I. and then B&A was built in 36. The Stinson plant went up in 40, that turned into Vultee, that built the P-38s and the bombers, and that's getting ready to get torn down. I got imagery. They let me go in and shoot it in 360. I can't release it until the demolition's done. But yeah, a lot of history in the aviators that came through it. And the 105th is the third oldest Air National Guard unit in the country and the oldest in the South.
As far as the competition between the different countries to achieve this first world flight, how long had like official attempts at it been taking place?
Just a year or two before the British and the French attempted it, they were the first to try it. And I'm not sure much about that flight, how far they got. So it was, after World War I, we basically dismantled our aviation. The French and the Germans saw the writing on the wall. And in fact, the Germans were Treaty of Versailles limited to balloons and dirigibles, but they were teaming up with the Soviets off the radar in developing aviation. And the French were way ahead of us, and we were falling way behind. Right here.
You mentioned the name Ogden,
Oh, Henry Ogden.
and who was he?
He was the backseater of the Boston that went down in the North Atlantic. He was from Little Town, Mississippi. I drove through there last year, and I stopped at an antique store and asked this elderly lady about Hank, and she'd never heard of him. It sounded like 500 people in it. And nobody heard of it, but that didn't surprise me. But yeah, they said his draw was slower than molasses in January.
So, Bob, I didn't have your resume. Could you tell them a little bit about your background?
Went to Hillwood High School, graduated Belmont, went to the Navy, spent 4 years in active duty, another 6 in the reserves, and then when the Gulf War broke out, I volunteered to go to the Air National Guard, and I was a navigator with them for 4 years. In civilian life, I did bank service work. We had financial services, and then I got into, we were distributors for LifeLock, and we lost that account, and I had to change careers at age 50. So I got into web design and multimedia, and which led me down this hole with AR and the virtual reality stuff.
What do you see happening with AI?
Well, we're talking right now, Metro Historical, if they survive this thing they're trying to do to them, they identified 6 American Indian sites in Davidson County. Brookmead Park is one of them. I'm the architect of Brookmead Park in 2002, and that's a long story, but it's the second largest dig that they've done of Native Americans. And so what I'm working on now is a virtual reality village. And I've got a prototype, but I want to go to UT because they've got a better model that I can take imagery of and then build it in 3D. So you have a QR code, you scan it, and boom, it's right in front of you. Like I've got 2 of the gunboats on the Cumberland from the Battle of Nashville already done, and you just have a QR code, and then it's right in front of you. And it's an educational tool. These kids dig it because they're using this stuff already. But it's a very cost-effective way. The only problem is, I talked to Tim Walker the other day, they're taking all their QR codes off the walking tour. You know why?
Wow.
Because people are putting fake ones on top of it trying to sell stuff. So we're like, holy moly. So I was talking to my son about it. I said, why don't we'll just print them so big, or put them up high. But if you printed one more than 8.5 by 11, they'd have to go to a lot of trouble, to print one that big on adhesive that would go over it. So I don't know. But it's a great vehicle for it. There's nothing to vandalize. There's really no cost at all if somebody like me does the model. I think it makes a lot of sense.
Well, thank you
Thank you.
so much.